People being unhappy with their job is not a rare occurrence. It's almost a given that there are many people in your office who want an exit as soon as possible, maybe even you. At some point, maybe you've even snapped and rebelled against your company overlords in some fashion. But as cool as you might have felt passive-aggressively sending that urgent email 3 days late on purpose, you'll never be as cool as the men who thumbed their noses at the $4 million, about $25.2 million today, being spent per day on their mission and said, "Not my problem," while in lower orbit, allegedly. On November 16, 1973, the crew from the final and longest mission of the Skylab program left the surface of the Earth. Gerald P. Carr, Edward G. Gibson, and William R. Pogue were the chosen ones to conduct the experiments for the 12 weeks aboard the space station. It should be noted here that all of them were rookies to space. Needless to say, sending them for the longest stay in orbit with the highest workload ever at that point was, to put it mildly, an odd decision. It may simply be that NASA wasn't very concerned, given that the crew of Skylab 3 were very successful in keeping up with their extremely packed schedule and even went above and beyond, using up their free time for even more work. Whatever the case, they decided to go big or go home and planned even more tasks for the longest mission of Skylab, even tacking many things on last minute without normal practice training for the astronauts. The beginning of the mission started with a minor prank. When the crew arrived at Skylab, they discovered 3 improvised dummies dressed with flight suits, a friendly prank left behind by the Skylab 3 crew. Immediately after, however, the pressure from mission control was on to such a degree that the crew was forced to leave the dummies in their positions temporarily while they spent considerable time setting everything up for their stay, as well as jumping right into their tasks afterwards, despite at the time having trouble just adjusting to moving around in space, as is common for anyone on their first time free-falling around the Earth. Things got even more dire on the schedule side of things when Pogue began suffering from space sickness, which is essentially fairly similar to motion sickness, and a none too pleasant and fairly common issue at first for many astronauts. Despite his troubles here, the crew made things worse for themselves by attempting to cover it up and acting like everything was fine. The issue did not go unnoticed forever by mission control, however, and to the embarrassment of the crew, ground control downloaded the internal conversations the crew had about it and their efforts to cover it up, resulting in Alan B. Shepard reprimanding them harshly about it over the comm. You see, part of the reason for them being there on Skylab in the first place was to study how humans, and pertinent to this issue, the human body, would react to being in space for such a lengthy period. Thus, such things as a crew member suffering from some malady were important to know about, as was collecting even the vomit that resulted from it for later study, something the crew were recorded discussing how to dispose of to keep the sickness a secret from mission control. From here, things got worse and worse, with the crew struggling to keep up with tasks and making more and more mistakes as time went on, further pushing things behind schedule. Rumblings thus began, with the crew reporting their workload was unreasonable and that they were starting to feel burnt out. On the ground, mission control noted it was unusual that Skylab 4 was not able to keep up with the tasks. Dr. Charles Berry, Director of Life Sciences, stated of this, "I don't know what is causing their slowness. They seem to be more fatigued and seem to need more sleep. It may be an individual variation. They may have the feeling of being pushed." On the note of sleep, it wasn't exactly always restful for the crew. Beyond normal things like stress and the rather different mode of sleeping while free-falling around the world, causing some level of insomnia at times, there were a lot of noises to awaken the crew randomly, such as when Skylab would go from darkness to sunlight and back several times during the 8-hour sleep cycle. The resulting large temperature swing, in turn, resulted in many loud pops and bangs from the space station. Despite all this, rather than do anything to fix the workload issues, Mission Control kept the pressure on to get their money's worth from the crew. Again, for reference here, every single day of the mission was costing John Q. taxpayer a whopping $4 million, about $25.2 million per day in today's money. But it couldn't last. 6 weeks into the mission, the oft-told story goes that the crew couldn't take it anymore, and Skylab 4 allegedly announced a strike and cut communications. As for how long the strike lasted, there are 2 versions of the story, one stating it was an entire day in which they simply relaxed and did their favorite downtime activity of staring out of the window, to the blackout lasting only for one orbit around Earth, about an hour and a half. Whatever the case, after communications resumed, Houston was supposedly furious, but if they wanted to get cooperation, the crew's demands had to be met. And so it was that they negotiated a settlement with the crew, coming out with a lighter schedule that not only turned out to be manageable for Skylab 4, but also, funnily enough, it made them more efficient than they were before, a phenomenon that Henry Ford had long ago observed when he cut worker hours dramatically in his factories, only to see production increase considerably off of the same workers working almost half the time. And we've got more on that in a bit. As for Skylab, a settlement reached, the first strike in space ended with it. Or at least that's the version many otherwise reputable sources widely disseminated on the interwebs and in print. The truth is, well, a little more complicated and much less dramatic, though still extremely fascinating on a number of levels. So what actually happened? To begin with, the astronauts really did take a day off around the time of the alleged strike events and really did have a one-Earth orbit communications blackout. However, astronaut Edward Gibson claimed that the interruption of communications wasn't any sort of rebellious act, but rather a product of simply being overworked and more mistakes creeping into their work and routine. He states, "In an effort to increase our efficiency, we occasionally would have only one of us listening to the voice traffic from the ground and responding to it, while the other two of us turned off our radios and worked without interruption. This sounded like a perfect plan, but the plan failed when the crew all turned off their radios for about one orbit. With all three focusing on their work intently, they simply didn't realize for over an hour." Yes, rather than just sitting around sipping Mai Tais, Gibson, Bogue and Carr actually just spent the entire blackout just working diligently. As for their day off just a couple of days before on December 26th, well, this was granted by Mission Control after the astronauts had to do a rather lengthy and involved spacewalk and simply desperately needed some semblance of a break. Gibson went on, "There was no strike in space by any stretch of the imagination. What could we threaten to do? Go live on the moon?" Going back to the blackout, as for Mission Control, they weren't initially upset about it, being more concerned as to what could have gone wrong to cause the crew to stop responding. Needless to say, they collectively took a huge sigh of relief when the crew of Skylab 4 finally started talking again. Now, this doesn't mean the crew on Skylab were perfectly content, and contrary to many an internet rumor, ground control did recognize this, as the crew weren't shy about the issues they were having. As noted by Gibson about their many complaints, that was half the point of them being up there, to give a detailed and accurate account of attempting to live in space. So everything from their dissatisfaction about their socks, which they complained about along with their other clothing a lot, to their workload was discussed. As Gibson would state, the purpose of these debriefings was to be hypercritical. You gotta say it like it is. Despite being peripherally aware of the complaints, Mission Control simply didn't think anything needed to change at first in terms of lessening the workload. In fact, they did the opposite and piled more and more work on. This was despite the fact that before the crew had even gone up, they'd all been told explicitly to expect a relatively light workload given they'd be in space for almost 3 months, and Mission Control wanted them to pace themselves, unlike other crews that had much tighter schedules. Said director of the Skylab program, William C. Schneider, "We didn't want to repeat the experience of the second crew, which had taken its meals on the run at an average 6 hours sleep a night. We'd told the third crew that we didn't want them to get tired out or sick, that we wanted them to work a plain 8-hour day, eat 3 square meals, and relax a bit. Having told them that, we increased the amount of experiments aboard and gave them second mission workloads, and the peak workloads of the second mission at that. So we had given them conflicting instructions, and then we began to wonder why they were doing what we had told them first to do, which was to slow down." For reference here, as previously alluded to, the second crew in their zeal had actually decided to spend almost all of their scant free time doing extra experiments pretty much the entire time aboard. Now, the third crew of Skylab was expected to keep up with that 7 days a week for almost 3 months, and they also didn't have the time that the second crew had to build up to the heavy work schedule. Flight director Neil Hutchinson further admitted that Mission Control was pushing excessively right from moment one, stating it was clearly a mistake on part of the control center. "We did not give them 1 ounce of zero-G time to get used to it. It was a serious mistake on part of the control center because we just expected Bill Pogue, Ed Gibson, and Jerry Carr to just jump right on the bandwagon and take off." Author Henry S.F. Cooper, in his incredibly detailed and well-written 2-part 58-page piece, Life in a Space Station, published in the New Yorker in 1976, sums up, "The problem since the beginning of the mission lay with the men on the ground, who in addition to giving the third crew too many experiments, had started them off at too fast a pace. This situation would not be rectified until later. It took the astronauts a while to learn to find things and do things in space, as well as they had found them and done them on the ground. It sometimes took 3 times as long to find equipment and set up an experiment at the beginning of a mission as it would have taken on Earth, or as it would take toward the end of a mission when the crew had mastered the complexities of getting around and working in weightlessness. Even the second crew had been in Skylab a month before they hit their stride, yet the ground was expecting Carr, Gibson, and Pogue to do as much work in the middle of their second week as Bean, Garriott, and Loosmer had needed a month to work up to. The members of the third crew fell behind almost immediately. They began having insomnia, and to make matters worse, the ground, instead of letting up on the schedule, began increasing the workload. At the beginning of the second week, which was when Hutchinson began increasing the workload, the crew's performance crumbled altogether. That's not to mention the extra extra experiments tacked on. Cooper goes on, the second crew's eagerness had convinced Mission Control, which could imagine few contingencies worse than having 3 men in space with nothing to do, that it should find additional experiments for the third crew to perform. Accordingly, the flight planners asked NASA's scientists and engineers to come up with some proposals fast. The response was overwhelming. The people at NASA always had many more ideas for experiments that could possibly be performed in space, and the third Skylab mission offered them their last opportunity for a long time. Most of the experiments had been added so late that there hadn't been time for the third crew to become familiar with them before the launch, or even to be told what their purpose was. Never having done it before, you're going to take probably 4 or 5 times as much time to do the task as the man who has been needling the flight controllers to have it included said it would. The result was the number of science demonstrations for the third crew had been doubled at the last minute. Most of them were not well put together on the ground. Gibson had to do most of the improvising, with ground having allotted only 10 minutes to move from one experiment to the next. You have to put up equipment, you have to debrief, and then you have to move from one position in the spacecraft to another, and you have to look and see what's coming up, and we're just being driven to the wall, Pogue said. There's not enough consideration given for moving from one point in the spacecraft to another and allowing for transitions from one experiment to another. When we're pressed bodily from one point in the spacecraft to another with no time for mental preparation, let alone getting the experiment ready, there's no way we can do a professional job. In essence, NASA was simply eager to make every second of the crew in space count, and were not only overloading the crew with too many tasks too quickly, but also had unreasonable expectations on how quickly the tasks could be done, as well as treating the astronauts like they were machines and not human beings. As noted by Hutchinson, we could have planned a guy's day without leaving a spare minute if we wanted to. We had the ability. We prided ourselves here that from the time the men got up to the time they went to bed, we had every minute programmed. The second crewman made us think this way. As for being treated like a machine, Pogue would later state of the whole ordeal, I then proceeded to make errors and berate myself. Finally, I came to the realization that I'm a fallible human being, that I cannot operate at 100% efficiency, that I am going to make mistakes. I tried to operate like a machine, and I was a gross failure. Now I'm trying to operate as a human being with limitations I possess. I think a person needs to more or less recreate himself, to pause and reflect occasionally. I think that in order to act creatively, you have to have certain periods of time when you have to just stop and think and see yourself and be aware of the situation and sort of involve yourself in the totality of the experience at hand. That said, despite the many complaints the crew had made, Hutchinson felt the crew should have raised their concerns more firmly sooner, stating, on their side of the equation, there was not enough communication early on to let us know that they were getting in trouble. It was the fighter-pilot mentality. I'll be damned if I'm going to cry uncle. Of course, as we continued to press them, more mistakes began to be made, more than we'd seen with other crews. And then you began to wonder, what's going on here? The control center had fouled up, and we just kept fouling up until we got them fouled up too. On the crew side, Carr somewhat concurred. We had told the people on the ground before we left that we were not going to allow ourselves to be rushed. Yet we got up here and we let ourselves just get driven right into the ground. We hollered a lot about being rushed too much, but we did not ourselves slow down and say to hell with everything else and just do things one after the other like we said we were going to do. As to how things eventually changed, the first on the ground to voice the problem, unsurprisingly, were the flight surgeons, with Cooper noting one of them told him later, at conferences, we were on the side of easing up, of saying that the flight plans were too much, but the engineers couldn't understand what we meant. We witnessed Mission Control getting off on the wrong foot, but there was no place to blow the whistle. And communication between us and the flight planners was not that good. They told us that the flight schedule was a non-medical duty. Eventually, enough was enough, however. Fed up with how things were going, commander of the mission, Carr, had a lengthy and very stern monologue laying things out to Mission Control, stating, we all kind of hoped before the mission, and everybody had the message, that we did not plan to operate at the second crew's pace. And I think really up here, my biggest concern is keeping the three of us alert and healthy. I think an illness is probably something that we can really do without. I'm also getting the feeling from some of the questions that have been asked of us the last few days that people down there are beginning to hassle over who gets our time and how much of it. We're beginning to get just little hints and indications up here that we're getting into a time bind, that it's got people really worried down there. People are asking about exercise. The medics are asking about exercise and do we really need as much as we're taking and why? And all that. And I'd like to know just exactly what everybody's motives are when they're asking those questions. I imagine you guys are probably caught right smack in the middle of it, and the questions that arise in my mind are we behind, and if so, how far? Or is all this hassle over our time a result of people coming out of the woodwork with new things to be done? That's essentially the big question, you guys, and that is, where do we stand? What can we do if we're running behind and we need to get caught up? What can we do that's reasonable? And we'd like to be in on the conversation, and we'd like to have some straight words on just what the situation is right now. Commander out. Carl would also snap at them, "There's nothing worse than having to gobble your meal in order to get some task done. That really should have been scheduled at some other time, so please, I think in future, if you would please loosen up. On the ground, I don't think we would be expected to work a 16-hour day for 84 days, and so I really don't see why we should even try to do it up here." As the mission control side, Hutchinson would state, "At first, when they began asking for time off, I felt it was unwarranted. Those guys know how valuable their time is up there. Then I saw we'd done a bad thing by forcing them. I saw they needed time to think about what they were doing and to re-establish themselves. They were not asking for time to read Betty Bye stories. We now see that time off is mandatory. A man has to get mental enjoyment out of something other than his work. We now feel that an astronaut's time off must be inviolate. We learned a marvelous lesson." Now, having been properly slapped over the head with the issue, Mission Control did indeed begin to consider the matter, and as noted by Hutchinson there, realized that the astronauts were right. And not only right, but that Mission Control had gone and done something they'd explicitly sworn that they wouldn't do before the mission had started. As to why it took them so long to realize this, Hutchinson later stated, "Our system was designed to squeeze every minute out of an astronaut's day. Suddenly the system is asked to stop for a few hours or a day to give a man some time off. The system doesn't want to do it. Say, for example, that there's a day off coming, but say there's a perfect pass over an Earth resources target, and that the only chance to get that target is on that day. Now, are we going to say to the scientist whose experiment it is, no goddammit? Interestingly, however, once NASA let up on the crew rather than taking much time off as now scheduled, the crew were happy to continue working on their own. It was even noted that Gibson particularly, who'd previously earned a reputation for complaining the most, was one of the most zealous, and he was practically giddy at times doing some of the experiments which he found extremely enjoyable. The real change was simply Mission Control was no longer pressing them to work faster on things, allowing the activities to take the time that they took, and just as importantly, giving them adequate breaks between their experiments to catch their breath and switch mental gears to focus on and prepare their next experiments and the like. As Gibson would later state, when asked what they did with their newfound free time, "Off-duty activities? You gotta be kidding. There's no such thing up here. Our day's off. The only thing that's different is that we get to take a shower." That said, this was a slight exaggeration, and there was some free time that they actually occasionally took, as well as their food breaks also becoming actual breaks instead of having to scarf down sustenance as quickly as possible, sometimes while conducting briefings with Mission Control. Paradoxically, from all this, once granted extra free time and the pressure explicitly off, as previously alluded to, the crew's daily productivity improved so much that they managed to surpass the daily productivity levels of the extremely productive Skylab 3 mission. On top of this, despite about half the mission being up at this point and behind schedule, this reversed the trend so much that by the end of the 84-day mission, the crew had not only completed all of the entire initially stated tasks, but also a large number of additional tasks, and even in their free time, they came up with some of their own additional ones on top of that. On this note, at one point during their free time, while doing the thing they universally loved the most, looking out the window despite being told not to, the crew took many photos of Earth from space, including photographing Area 51. This created something of a problem as NASA was obliged to publish these photos to the public. Naturally, there was a great amount of discussion across government agencies about these photos and whether this should be an exception, and the images kept classified. Ultimately, it was decided to include them in the Skylab image archive with every other picture they'd taken, excepting of course the ones showing the Lizard Overlord ships and the Orion slave women aboard the Skylab with the crew. In any event, the mission finally ended on February the 8th, 1974, with 1,214 revolutions completed around the Earth, and it was considered a huge success, both in terms of what it explicitly accomplished in countless experiments, as well as valuable lessons learned on how hard one can push crews and the need for building in downtime. All that said, some still argue that the space strike actually did happen, and quotes from those involved since are something of a PR cover-up, and it's occasionally pointed out that none of these astronauts ever flew in space again, with the implication being that they could not be trusted to do so anymore. But it should be noted that NASA only had one other human crewed mission to space after this in July of 1975, until the first Space Shuttle orbit STS-1 in April of 1980. 1981. At this point, all 3 of these astronauts had already retired from NASA. In the interim, all 3 did hold positions inside NASA directly after the mission, and none of them have ever suggested a strike happened, even decades after the fact, when nobody would really care if this is revealed. Despite this, many still cite the incident as a strike or mutiny in space without actually giving any credible sources for this. Indeed, if you read contemporary articles from, for example, the New York Times during the mission, not one mention of strike or mutiny is found. They do mention things like lethargy, inefficiency, mistakes being made, the crew feeling burnt out and in need of a day off, but any indication of acts of rebellion where communications were shut down purposefully are missing from contemporary accounts. As for the first to suggest there was some sort of crew mutiny, this appears to be from the aforementioned otherwise incredibly well-written and researched 2-part, extremely lengthy piece by Henry S.F. Cooper in 1976, published in the New Yorker on August the 22nd and September the 6th of that year, entitled Life on a Space Station. Among the combined 58-page expose on what it was like to live aboard Skylab, Cooper only alludes to a strike twice, and even then, it's not really clear whether he thought there was a literal strike or whether he was just saying the crew had become fed up and demanded a day off, which they were then given. On that note, it's speculated Cooper was probably referring to the day off they were granted on December the 26th, though this isn't fully clear. As for the first allusion to some sort of strike, he states the crew members were kept to a rigid timetable and almost every minute was planned for them by the ground. What nobody foresaw, though, was that some of the astronauts would rebel. He goes on, the members of the third crew didn't always wake up refreshed in the morning, and sometimes they weren't eager to pop out of bed. Flight controllers and others at Space Center, who had never been faced with reluctant astronauts before, openly described them as lethargic and negative. The men at the Space Center were worried about the men in Skylab and wondered whether some strange alchemy of space had changed their characters. As the second instance, this is where the word strike occurs. It should be noted, however, he doesn't actually anywhere explicitly state the crew had any conflict with mission control about this off day, simply that they took it. Although by his wording, it does seem implied that it was forced on mission control by the crew, stating the third crew went on a sort of sit-down strike on one day about halfway through the mission. That day, Carr, Gibson and Bogue stopped working and did exactly what they felt like doing. Gibson spent the day at the solar console, and Carr and Bogue sat in the war room looking out of the window and taking a lot of pictures, not of scientific targets, but of things that they wanted to take. Cooper would further publish a book, A House in Space, where he likewise repeated this. Given that the entire rest of the piece by Cooper is exceptionally and extremely well researched and detailed on just about every level, it's not surprising that people took and ran with the sort of a sit-down strike one day remark and seemingly blew it out of proportion from what Cooper was probably originally intending. This was all given further credence and more widely popularized thanks to a 16-page case study by Michael B. McCaskey and E. Mary Lou Balbaki of Harvard Business School, published on July 1st, 1980, where it was summed up: a 3-man Skylab crew, after repeatedly unsuccessful attempts to influence Houston Mission Control to slow down the work pace, turns off radio communication and refuses to talk. As for their source for this assertion, they cite none other than Cooper's work on the matter. However, it should be noted here that at no point in Cooper's original 2-part lengthy piece in the New Yorker did he state any of that. And as noted, the communications interruption was very clearly based on recorded communications before and after the event, as well as accounts from the crew, just a slip-up. And during the very brief blackouts, they continued to work. Since then, the story has been picked up by many otherwise credible sources, with the internet helping to widely disseminate the story from there. On this note, according to NASA themselves, in a review of the scholarly and public literature on the subject, it appears that all subsequent references to the alleged strike originate with these 2 sources: Harvard Business School's case study and Cooper's work. Given the Harvard source simply cites Cooper, it would appear that 2 sources is a bit generous, however, and there really was just one Mr. Cooper, who, again, if you read his phenomenal 58-page piece, Life in a Space Station, and what it was like living aboard Skylab, you'll see he's being thrown under the bus a little bit on this one. It is unequivocally one of the most detailed and interesting articles on life in space. In the end, there appears zero evidence of any strike, despite the crew being overworked to an extreme degree. But once reasonably discussed with ground control, changes were made and efficiency skyrocketed. Turns out, happy, relatively rested workers given enough time to do their tasks and adequate breaks in between improves just about every facet of quality of work and efficiency. who knew? Well, actually, Henry Ford knew about half a century before, which is in part why most of us enjoy a 5-day, 40-hour work week. On September the 25th, 1926, the Ford Motor Company instituted a 5-day, 40-hour work week for its factory employees. While Ford wasn't the first to do this, they were arguably one of the most influential. This action, at least initially, did not win Ford many friends among his fellow business owners, some of whom believed giving the working man any time off just encouraged him to indulge in drink even more than he did already. To be fair, this was a real problem in this era. It was not from nothing that excessive drink was blamed for many of society's woes at the time, ultimately inspiring prohibition, which even a very large percentage of said drinkers supported in the beginning. But, of course, if you had to work 14 to 16-hour days, 6 days per week from your very early teens on, for reference, in 1890 the average work week in the United States for a blue-collar factory worker was 90 to 100 hours, you might be driven to drink excessively too as a bit of a coping mechanism. Beyond massively cutting work hours, many competing employers were still miffed at Ford for raising his male workers' salaries up to $5 per day, about $116 today back in 1914, double the going former rate. And around the same time, he also cut the typical work week down to 48 hours at his factories. Women had to wait until 1916 to command the same wage. But since Ford was one of the world's largest manufacturers, most in the industry were once again compelled for various reasons to follow their example, like it or not. Ford stated in his company's newsletter, "Just as the 8-hour day opens our way to prosperity in America, so the 5-day work week will open our way to still greater prosperity. It is high time to rid ourselves of the notion that leisure for workmen is either lost time or a class privilege." Of course, Ford wasn't just doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He understood that a 5-day work week with 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest would encourage working people to vacation on weekends, shop on Saturdays, and have ample free time to fill during their daily 8-hour recreation time per day. People with more leisure time required more clothing, ate a greater variety of food, and of course were far more likely to be in the market to buy an automobile to travel around in. Workers who were paid more also were much more likely to be able to afford such an automobile. Beyond benefiting sales as other companies followed suit, he had also observed that happy workers, both in home and work life, meant better and more efficient workers. And indeed, as Ford had thought, after instituting these changes, productivity skyrocketed, meaning that he was getting more results from significantly fewer work hours, and company loyalty and pride among Ford employees was equally massively boosted. Beyond low-skilled laborers banging down the doors to get to work at Ford, he now had the luxury of having the top talent in each of the high-skilled fields he needed applying for work in droves. Needless to say, manufacturers all over the world would soon follow Ford's example, which played right into his vehicle-selling hands. Edsel Ford, Henry's son and then company president, was quoted in March of 1922 in the New York Times as saying of this, "Every man needs more than 1 day a week for rest and recreation. The Ford Company always has sought to promote an ideal home life for its employees. We believe that in order to live properly, every man should have more time to spend with his family." Ford himself laid it all out in black and white. The harder we crowd business for time, the more efficient it becomes. The more well-paid leisure workmen get, the greater become their wants. These wants soon become needs. Well-managed business pays high wages and sells at low prices. Its workmen have the leisure to enjoy life and the wherewithal with which to finance that enjoyment. Bonus fact. Contrary to popular belief, the color of the sun is not yellow, but rather is a very white color in the human visual spectrum, assuming one could look at it unfiltered from space without murdering our eyeballs. The reason the sun looks yellow to us on Earth is that our atmosphere scatters light from the sun, so the apparent color of the sun changes. This same scattering effect is why the sun looks blue in the daytime instead of black like at night. Specifically, what is going on here is the Earth's atmosphere scatters the light in the blue and violet wavelength range, so the remaining wavelengths of light appear yellow. This same effect is why the sky will so often appear yellow when the sun is disappearing over the horizon, as well as why the sky/sun can appear more red at times during this phase of the day. As the sun is setting, more of the shorter wavelength blue is being scattered because of the decreased angle of the sun relative to you, thus the light has to pass through more atmosphere to get to you. This increased diffusion results in less of the blue wavelength being visible to you, and thus what remains appears yellow. Similarly, if it is dusty or there are a lot of other larger particles in the air, this will filter out larger wavelengths, resulting in a red sky and a red sun.